In many matters relating to Scottish witchcraft and witches, the talk of second sight is commonplace. According to old Scottish folklore, second sight was a magical gift which allowed chosen people to have immense knowledge. It allowed others to foretell the future, and some could see the evil artifacts of witchcraft. These so-called images of witches could determine if someone was a witch or if a person was affected by a witch's curse. Most of the time, this information was never shared, as a large number of those people who were granted the second sight would become involved in dark magic and witchcraft themselves. But every few hundred years, someone would be born with all three gifts of the second sight, yet have a soul that was pure and innocent. They would use this ancient power for what they believed was the good of mankind. Janet Douglas. Janet Douglas was born sometime in the mid-17th century, somewhere in the Western Islands of Scotland. There is not much known about her early years, although it is said that she was born with the power of second sight. During the early 1670s, a very young Janet would publicly demonstrate her skills by telling fortunes and hunting out witches or black magic in the local area. At around the age of 10, this young girl was sent to the Pollock estate on the outskirts of Glasgow to become a maid in the service of Sir George Maxwell of Aldhouse. There she did her duty and worked hard, but during that summer, Sir George fell gravely ill. Confined to his bed, Maxwell sent for doctors and physics from the city, but none could aid him with his terrible sickness. Then on one afternoon, his new maid told him that a grim image was held over his spirit, and it was the work of witchcraft. Janet even implicated a local widow, saying that she had seen the same image above her spirit, so was certain this curse was of her doing. Sir George was already a well-known zealot when it came to the persecution of witches. So when given this information by young Miss Douglas, Sir George quickly ordered his men to the widow's house. Maxwell's men forced their way into the house and dragged the widow, her children, and 3 of her friends before Sir George. As the panicked locals were locked into heavy iron manacles, they could see the nobleman talking with what appeared to be a small child. The young girl began to point at each of them in turn, all apart from the widow's 14-year-old daughter. Sir George ordered that the widow, her son, and her 3 friends would be burned to death at the stake for the practice of witchcraft. The widow's daughter was spared, as Janet saw that her heart was pure. During a later search of the widow's house, a small clay figure in the likeness of Sir George was found. This was a powerful artifact of dark magic known as a clay corpse or corp credach. It would seem that this effigy was the cause of his ills. Once the figure had been destroyed, Sir George began to feel much better and became free of his illness. He would praise the young girl for her help, and before long, all of Glasgow knew of Janet Douglas and her magical sight. Janet left the service of Maxwell soon after that incident. It was around this time she met with Douglas of Barloch, who lived in the Barloch estate near Glasgow. Douglas was in a period of mourning as he had tragically just lost both of his sons, who drowned while trying to cross a fast-flowing river. The young girl persuaded the man that his horrible loss was actually the work of foul magic and enemies of the family. She offered to help the grieving father hunt down the witches so he could enact justice upon them. That very day, John Gray, Janet McNair, Thomas Mitchell and Mary Mitchell were arrested and imprisoned for the crime of witchcraft and murder. Once again, the evidence against them was the testimony of a now 11-year-old girl who could see the darkness in the soul of the accused. All 4 were burned alive for their evil deeds. The stories and tales of this innocent girl, gifted with a powerful second sight, flooded the streets of Glasgow. In fact, Janet was so well known that on her first visit to the city, she was mobbed by people seeking for a cure to their personal ills. This entrance to the city was recorded by a local reverend named George Hicks in a letter he wrote to the English diarist Samuel Pepys. As she was surrounded with the crowds, she called out to one man, a goldsmith, as I remember, and told him that of so long a time he had not thriven in his trade, though he was very diligent in it, because an image was made against him, which he might find in the corner of a shop. And when the man went home, there he found it, where she said it was. An image was such, both as to matter and form, as she had described it, a rude image made of clay. She told another that he and his wife, who had been a very loving couple, of late had lived in great discord, to the grief and astonishment of them both. And when the man asked the reason, she answered as she did before, that there was an image made against them. The great mass of frenzied people gathering round this one girl began to become more frenzied by the minute. At one point, Janet accused a bystander of being in league with the devil, and a small riot broke out in the streets. So bad was the fallout of her entrance that the local magistrate ordered the girl be kept in protective custody for her own safety and the well-being of the city. Janet was released from the local jail after a few days when all the commotion had calmed. Then the young girl decided to head to Edinburgh. Even during the 17th century, the idea of an 11-year-old girl travelling alone to the nation's capital was quite odd, not to mention very dangerous. But eventually, the young Douglas would arrive in Scotland's capital. Here she received a welcome similar to that of her first appearance in Glasgow. The streets were crammed with locals, looking for aid and ready to hunt the devils among them. Quickly the Privy Council, who advised the monarch on affairs of state, took the girl into protective custody. Janet was imprisoned at the Canongate toll booth for causing a public riot, and it was during this period of confinement that the Reverend George Hicks was granted leave to interview the girl. With him the Reverend brought Robert Scott, minister of Holyrood Abbey, an authority on the divine and the occult. In the first interview with Janet, the pair could not get much information. The girl was shy and reluctant to talk. She told them that she was suspicious, and that perhaps the pair had been sent to betray her. Eventually the girl proposed a deal. She would answer any and all questions truthfully, if the clergymen could use their sway with the Lord High Commissioner to grant her freedom. The conditions were agreed upon, and Hicks promised to do all he could to grant her freedom from her prison cell. Much was learned about Janet Douglas and her powers over the course of multiple interviews. She told the Reverend that she was born with her powers of second sight, and that she hoped they were a gift from God, but each day she feared that they may have come from evil. She would renounce Satan and all his works each and every night during prayer before bed. She would ask God to help her along her path and to hunt out the evil before her. Hicks commented that the girl seemed to command a vast and unusual level of knowledge, especially for one who was completely uneducated. One passage in particular demonstrates Janet's intelligence, and what I think is the Reverend's preconceived notions of the Highlanders. When I was with her, I asked of her parentage, but she would tell me nothing of it. I also told her how I observed how her words and expressions were of better sort, and asked how she, being a Highlander and in appearance a poor girl, came to speak so well. To this she artfully replied by asking me why I should suppose it so difficult for her to learn to express herself well. Indeed, her wit and cunning were both answerable to her assurance, which I told you was very great. On the subject of her powers, Janet told that she would receive visions from time to time, and these would always occur while she was awake. The haunting figures or images that she saw surrounding the people she suspected of evil doing were an outward apparition, meaning they existed within our physical reality, but could only be seen by those with the second sight, and denied that any image had been from imagination or formed within her mind. While seeing these auras or spirits, Janet claimed that she felt entirely normal. There was no fits or seizures, she had no weakness or faintness, and neither her speech or movement was affected in any form. Both of the clergymen were at a loss to explain Janet's unnatural powers, and after a few meetings with the girl, the Lord High Commissioner removed their ability to visit, since it showed no promise. The Reverend did all he could to convince the Lord High Commissioner, John Maitland, Duke of Lauderdale, to release the young girl. The Commissioner's only answer was at this time it would not be convenient to release Janet Douglas for certain reasons. X would never again see the strange girl with the amazing powers of second sight, but this is not the last we would hear about Janet Douglas. Later that same year, while still imprisoned, Janet was ordered to appear before the council. Presiding over this trial was Archbishop Sharp. He accused the girl of using sorcery and witchcraft. This Janet adamantly denied, and told that she endeavoured only to discover evil and countermine the kingdom of darkness. The bishop insisted that the girl was to be sent to the West Indies to live out her remaining years as a slave on one of the many plantations. Janet replied to this with the following statement. "My lord," she said, "who was with you in your room Saturday night last, betwixt 12 and 1 o'clock?" The Archbishop went a pale white, and his face was the very vision of terror. He rose slowly from his seat and without saying a word, left the council chamber. Upon watching the bishop leave in this haunting manner, the Duke of Rothes rose and asked the young girl who visited the bishop. At first Janet refused, but upon the Duke's promise that she would not be sent to the plantations, Janet eventually said, "My lord, the bishop met with the very devil himself." It is unknown what happened to the bishop after this shocking reveal. However, it is known that Janet was set free. Some say she went to England. Others believe she returned home to the Highlands. Whatever happened, the young Janet Douglas vanished into the shadow and was never heard of or seen again. I will leave you now with two quotes about Janet from Reverend George Hicks. "This girl, as I have observed before, was of a bold, undaunted spirit, and might bear those sights, from what cause soever, without any fear or perturbation, which others of more passive tempers and less stock of animal spirit could not so well endure. Some suspected her for an impostrix, but others, of whom I was one myself, thought that she was really what she pretended, being induced to that opinion from the notoriety of the facts, which the most incredulous and suspicious could not deny." Thank you for listening, and I would like to give a special thank you to my first ever patron for helping support the channel.